Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, I was really excited to be able to talk with author Tom Falkenstein, who's written the book called The Highly Sensitive Man. This is a really insightful interview, and I love the things that we talk about. So let me give you a couple of highlights. Tom talks about the pressure that men feel that they're not living up to the masculine ideal, and then that pressure to be stoic, self-reliant, to be competitive. We were fortunate enough to get some questions from our closed Facebook group, and some of the questions that he answers are, how do men balance being sensitive with the traditional idea of men being strong and not showing their emotions? We also talk about how can parents better support their highly sensitive boys, especially when they're already getting messages that it's not okay to be too sensitive. And one of the other questions that we talk about is, when is it that men start to lose that ability to trust their intuition or their inner voice, and they start to believe everything that they're told instead? It's really a very interesting conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Let me tell you a little bit about Tom, and his full bio will be in the show notes. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version. Tom Falkenstein has worked in the mental health sector since 1999. He's a behavioral psychotherapist, and he's worked doing that since 2006. He's been training with Dr. Elaine Aron, author of The Highly Sensitive Person, since 2015. And he founded the European Center for High Sensitivity, which is in Germany. He's currently practicing in Berlin, and he also offers consultations for highly sensitive people in both English and German. And The Highly Sensitive Man is his first book. It was published in Germany, and it's been translated into a number of other languages. Thank you so much for sharing this podcast with other people. It continues to grow. You can help me out by continuing to share it. If you're open to rating and review it, that would be great. And now, on to the show. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Patricia. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for asking. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me, and thanks for showing interest in my book, The Highly Sensitive.
I love that you're talking about the highly sensitive male, and I really want to give my listeners as much exposure to things that are going to help them have information. So just to say, where are you at right now physically?
Yeah, I'm in my office, sitting at my desk. It's evening. I'm based in Berlin. It's quite cozy, but we rearranged some furniture at the moment. So cozy, but a little bit chaotic around me, but it's all right. It's all right.
All right. Sounds great. So, Tom, do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
I do. Yes, I do.
And when did you find out you were highly sensitive?
So I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and I never heard of the term high sensitivity or sensory processing sensitivity, as it's called in academic terms, until after my postgraduate training in psychotherapy. And it was a time where I lived and worked in London as a psychotherapist, and I just happened to see a lot of young male clients who all mentioned having struggled with their sensitivity all their lives, basically. And that was in spring 2013, almost 7 years ago. And then I just sort of, it made me think about the term sensitivity and sensitivity as a trait, not so much as a state that might go hand in hand with a, psychological problem or disorder. And through that research, well, through those clients, and then through trying to research sensitivity and trying to find, a book or some papers on sensitivity or that I could, show them, because a lot of them struggled being very sensitive. I then learned about the term high sensitivity and Elaine Aron's research that she's been doing since the 90s. And through that whole process, through then reading a lot about high sensitivity, I tried to read as many books in English and German as possible, I noticed that I was highly sensitive myself, but I never really, up until 2013, I never really heard about it, and therefore didn't really identify with the concept.
Interesting. I'm wanting to ask you stuff, but I'm wanting to stay on track. So,
Yeah.
What do you think of the term highly sensitive person?
Well, when I read about it for the first time in 2013, as I just mentioned, I thought it was, I don't want to sound too dramatic about it, but I thought it was a really interesting and almost groundbreaking concept to me that I found very helpful as a psychotherapist in my work. Having said that, I think the term, I think it comes, there's something about the name, I don't know, about the description being highly sensitive that seems to trigger a lot of negative responses in people. Maybe it has to do with our rather ambivalent attitude towards sensitivity. I don't know whether on the one hand, I think being sensitive is seen as something positive and, oh, he or she is very sensitive. But then I think you can also have a tinge of overly sensitive. I know that Elaine Aron, I think she once said to me, I try to come up with sometimes I think I should have come up with a different name for it, just because it creates so strong reaction sometimes, the term high sensitivity. And I can see where she comes from. I think she's right. But I think it's an important concept, hugely important concept. And I think it names what it is, I mean, highly sensitive means you're very sensitive. So yes, I have slightly conflicted feelings about it, I would say. About the term, not about the concept at all. I think it's hugely important, but about the name, let's say, the term.
Right. I agree with you. I'm sure that at the time that it seemed like it was a great name to call it, and this is not about whether Dr. Aron should have named it something different. I just think that sensitivity brings up ideas of being emotional and weepy, where when I ask us, in fact, let me ask you this, is there another term that you wish were used or that you think is maybe more descriptive or accurate?
Well, I do sometimes use highly reactive. I'm not sure that is particularly more positive sounding, but I think that I quite like in some ways. And I also I'm in touch with this researcher called Michael Pluess, he's a Swiss researcher, but he's based in London, and I interviewed him for the book. And I know he's done does research with Elaine Aron as well, and he uses the umbrella term for all the different research that's been going on in regards to sensitivity. He uses the umbrella term environmental sensitivity, and I do think that sounds maybe a bit less to being very environmentally sensitive, let's say, maybe brings out less strong reactions in people. I don't know. So I quite like that term.
Yeah, I've had guests say highly responsive, highly intuitive, tuned in, highly perceptive. And it feels like to me those are less charged words that I would imagine that regardless of your gender or your orientation, those would maybe feel more descriptive than sensitive just because of what it connotates.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But then maybe it's it's important that people change their perception about what the connotations that come with the word, as sensitive. So maybe we should stick to it. I don't know.
Sure. So Tom, for listeners that are tuned in that identify as male, what are some things that you find are important for them to know that are different than maybe being someone who identifies with being a highly sensitive female? And then I'm really trying to be mindful about my non-gendered language. And so for someone who's non-binary, I'm not even sure how to language it. So I'm just acknowledging that I'm learning and I don't even know how to ask a question about where someone that's non-binary would fit in with this.
Yeah, well, I think it's good just to mention that exactly, that is something you're aware of and you're mindful of or trying to be mindful of. Well, as I said earlier, when I happened to have a lot of young clients in spring 2013 who were all in their early 20s and who all talked about in their first session for me, I was working at a psychiatric clinic at the time in London, and I saw patients for very different reasons, depression, anxiety, personality, and they all, as I said earlier, they all talked about that they struggled being very sensitive all their life, or they got the feedback from the environment that, the message is that this is somehow not right for that, to be that sensitive, to be that emotional, to be too feminine in a way. And that really made me think about the term sensitivity, as I said earlier, but also sensitivity in men. And when I then learned about high sensitivity, I noticed that there were no books about highly sensitive men. I know that they were often mentioned in the books that were written, that they were out there about high sensitivity, but there was not a single book that just focused on them. And when I looked at all the books, apart from Ted Zeff's books about boys, highly sensitive boys, I should mention that. But then when I looked at all the covers for the books, the books, I also noticed that they clearly were very gendered and really clearly tried to appeal to female buyers, basically. So I thought it was, first of all, it was really important to me to write this book just to give the message to highly sensitive men that they exist and that high sensitivity exists in men just as it does in women. The book itself, so just writing the book itself and doing the research on it and interviewing, loads of highly sensitive men, or at least men who identify themselves highly sensitive, seem really important to me. So I think, first of all, it's really important for them, for your listeners who are male, and for those who are male and those who are highly sensitive, just to know, okay, they're not alone. It exists, loads of them, there are loads of highly sensitive men out there, and there's a book for them that obviously is a book that can be read by women as well, or non-binary people, who don't identify as male or female, but, fall into those groups. But and obviously, I think the second half of the book is quite practical. So I think these are all, they're very specific tools. But I just thought it was important to make highly sensitive men visible, or make high sensitivity visible in men, basically, through writing this book. So that strikes me as, first of all, really important. And to address in this book that a lot of highly sensitive men that I spoke to really struggled because they didn't fulfill, not all of them, but many of them described that they grew up with a sense that they were not all right as they were, that they didn't fulfill the boy code, that they were slightly different, from many other boys. They were, as I said earlier, a bit too emotional, or they were, interested in other things that the typical, I don't want to generalize too much, but let's say that, what they thought the typical boy was not interested in. So I just thought it was really, really important to mention the struggle a lot of highly sensitive men seem to have had as children, but also as grown-up men. Yeah, still feeling that they're not living up to the masculine ideal in many ways, which I think still is to an extent. I know things are changing, but I still think there seems to be the sense, if you look into the research and the psychology, there still seems to be very much the sense that the ideal man is stoic and not too emotional and self-reliant, can compete, and all these things. So anyway, I just think those things seem very important to me to mention in the book.
Well, and it's interesting that I listened to your book on Audible before we interviewed. And I don't know if you've heard the English version, but the author, because there are parts of your book where it switches to a narrative of a highly sensitive male, and the author's voice would change. I'm not a speech therapist. I'm going to use the words change register. That may not be technically correct. It's interesting that I hate when I'm not able to be clear and articulate. So when the author was narrating your part, it felt masculine, whatever that means. And then as soon as the narrator would switch into reading another highly sensitive male's perspective, the register would change and it was a little soft. Have you experienced that maybe in the German version, or do you know what I'm speaking of? And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, thank you for raising that. I was not aware of it. Obviously, that's, something that I'm not that happy about, hearing that, because I do think it is important. I think when we talk about highly sensitive men, I think it's important to, not to portray them in a stereotypical way, and to respect that it is a diverse, not homogeneous group, although they might share certain similarities and certain characteristics associated with being highly sensitive. I think it's important to mention that they're not all the same. And I think I'm saying that because I think, for example, I interviewed about over 20 people for the book Highly Sensitive Men, and I included 9 interviews in the book of men that I picked. And for me, it was really quite important to show that there's a variety in them. So, for example, one of them is a lawyer, another one, is an artist, one of them is gay, some of them are fathers, others are single. So I just sort of thought it was really important for me to show that the diversity, and I think to portray them as, not every highly sensitive man that I've met is particularly softly spoken or is an artist. I wasn't aware of that in the audio recording, and I only listened to bits of it of the German version. So I'm not sure what it's like in what the German version is.
Yeah, what I'm imagining, and this is entirely my projection, is that when it came to read the part of another highly sensitive male, that instead of choosing from like cowboy or, I know that's very stereotypical, but from all the different voices that the narrator could use, I think that they drew from a very small, there was nothing that was blatant about it. And I did notice a definite shift every time the narrator would switch to reading a narrative of another highly sensitive male. And I had a reaction to it.
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. I had no idea. You have very little influence, as an author about these things. And I was very happy that there was an audiobook in the first place. That is not a given. But that's a shame. I think.
It's kind of an ironic indication that in this audiobook that a stereotype is being perpetuated. And I have to say, Tom, that as we're talking, that there's a part of me that, being a highly sensitive person, that I want to come in with that disclaimer, well, maybe nobody else would hear it. And part of what we know being highly sensitive is that we pick up on very subtle details and cues. So instead of defaulting to that, well, maybe I'm making this up, I'm going to own that I heard something different. Nobody else may hear it. I know I did, and I'm going to honor that.
Yes, good. I think that's good, and to take that, to acknowledge that, and to make sure this is your perception, and it's important to honor that. Exactly. But I think it's really interesting. Just one last thing about this. I think it's so interesting how, when I wrote this book, it was very important to me to, on the one hand, to write a book that doesn't exclude women, obviously. So I'm always very happy when I get emails from female readers who liked it or who found it even helpful themselves. But so on the one hand, it was important to me to include practical tools and things that from my experience, I think are quite helpful when you're highly sensitive. But on the other hand, the first half of the book is much more theoretical. And it was really important to me to place the research that is being done on high sensitivity in its context, and to talk about mental health issues in men, and look some of the statistics, which are rather frightening, I think, when you really look into the suicide rates and the mortality rates. But I think it's very interesting how subtle, what you just said in terms of, you listen to the audio and you think, oh, just a moment, there's a slight shift here. And how ironic is it that there's a book written by a highly sensitive man, about highly sensitive men, where the same, in a way, stereotype is being confirmed. And I think it is interesting talking about this book and writing about this book is how quickly people, although the responses have been very positive, but there's sometimes, I remember an interview with a journalist who said to me, oh, but things have changed so much, and now loads of men stay at home, and I just sort of feel like, yes, things have changed, in terms of raising children, and they stay at home, or they, it's much more equal. And I do think a lot of it has changed. But I think there are still, there's sort of a lot of issues and a lot of things we talk about, a lot of the pressures that I think highly sensitive men feel to conform. I think all men really, but I think maybe particularly highly sensitive men who are in some ways don't live up to the male ideal, the masculine ideal. I think those forces and those pressures are very subtle. They can be very subtle, they don't have to be, but, just like that, just the fact that a narrator who talks about who does the audiobook, if he switches into a different tone of voice. I just think it's really interesting because it just shows how subtle some of those things are. Does it make sense? What
It totally does. And, this is where I feel really challenged because I run a meetup, and recently there was a question about being in a relationship with an HSP and a non-HSP. And while I think it's really important for us to understand the traits of HSPs, relationships are hard. And so it's about relationships being hard. And so in having this conversation with you, I want to focus on what is unique to the male or someone who identifies as male being highly sensitive. And I think it's about all highly sensitive people because we share the same traits. And so there's really that distinction between not wanting to blend and group people together. So to honor the individual differences and the pressures that we have politically and gender-wise, and there's still a common thread. And so how do you talk about it in a way that honors the individuality and the commonality? And I don't have an answer for that.
Sorry, Patricia, it's the last bit again. I had a problem with my microphone.
Sure.
Last bit again?
How do we honor the individual differences and where we come from politically and gender-wise and our unique experiences that are unique because of oppression and whatever we've experienced, and at the same time honor that we also share many things that are common to all of us? And so how do you talk about it in a way that respects the individual and the group experience?
I mean, I don't know whether this answers the question, but what was really important to me writing this book was to, on the one hand, say, okay, this temperamental trait is real, it exists. There's loads of research that is being done. Yes, there's loads of stuff that we don't know, but there's also an awful lot that we do know about it. And these are the characteristics of it, and these are the challenges that a lot of people have, whether they're male or female, when they're highly sensitive. And these are some tools that you might find helpful. On the other hand, it was really important to me to say, and I literally spell it out in the conclusion and in the introduction, I think, don't reduce yourself to one single temperamental trait. Don't reduce yourself to a label. I think it is an important part of your personality, and I think it's something to honor, and I think it's something to possibly make, changes in your life for, and I think it's important to know about. But I also think don't neglect your other influences and your other things that have shaped you that are might be very different from the next person who's highly sensitive. So is that where you're coming from?
Yes. I mean, this is just, even on this podcast, I talk about the highly sensitive person in generalities, and it doesn't honor that everybody experiences things differently. And I think that that's just a challenge that we have when we talk about traits in general. I do want to say that listening to your book, I really enjoyed it. And like you said, I think that regardless of what gender or how you show up in the world, I think the information is really relevant. And what I liked is you really provided a lot of tangible and concrete tools that people can use in the second half of the book. Research is challenging for me to read. That's just not how I'm wired. And so it was a little bit of like work to get through the first half of the book. I'm just saying what's true for me, and I really enjoyed the tools. So it's something that I really would recommend. And you talk a lot about mindfulness and what we tell ourselves. And although we use different language, many of the concepts are very similar to things that I think are really important when we're working with our traits and trying to figure out how to turn the things that we think are wrong into strengths.
Yes. I think, in terms of what you just said, to me, I'm a psychologist. So to me, it was really important to include the research because I didn't want, I don't know how it is perceived in America, obviously, but I know that at least, certainly when I started writing the book now almost 4 years ago, I started writing it. In 2015, I started writing it. Then in Germany, I know that a lot of people thought that high sensitivity and the whole concept is rather new agey and esoteric. And I still know that, for example, loads of my colleagues either don't know about it or they don't really think it's something that exists, let's say. For me, it was very important to, whether you like the research bit or not, and I think, and it's completely fine to skip it or to go straight to the second half. And if you want to kill some time, at one point you might want to come back to it and look at it. But to me, it was just really important to include, and whether then people like reading about it or not, or that is fine. It's you make it your own. The book, whatever you want to take from it.
Sure. And there's great information in there. I think being familiar with the DOES from Dr. Elaine Aron, I think talking about differential susceptibility, I think all those things are really relevant and important.
And it is really important, I think, also because I don't know how you feel, but I sometimes get the sense looking on if I look up high sensitivity online, or if I look at some online groups, I sometimes get the sense that it can go into a very different direction from the original research, going back to what Elaine Aron says, or even Michael Pluess says in regards to environmental sensitivity. So it just seems, there still seems to be a lot of misunderstandings, I feel, about it. So therefore, it felt really important to include that research bit. So, I wouldn't have felt good, not including
No,
it.
I totally agree with you. And I just was, just sharing what goes on for me.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good to know. I mean, it's good to hear that, and I think it's good to hear that you felt maybe the second half more accessible or more.
Well, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, what I want to do is get a hard copy of your book, because I always love finding new ways to talk about the traits and the strengths. And I really heard you talk about things. I mean, this is what I do for my career. I run online courses. This is what my specialization is. And it's always really nice to talk with other people and to get new vocabulary and a new perspective and a little bit of a way to add a little bit more dimension. So while I find research personally challenging, it doesn't mean that there's not good stuff in there that I wouldn't like to add to how I talk about the trait anyway. So I just want to be clear, I'm just a little bit more honest and upfront than most people are. So
No, that's good. So I like it. I like hearing some feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you for being so honest.
Sure. I want to jump in. We got some questions. I have a closed Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive, and it's an amazing group. I got some questions from some of the folks in that group that I want to ask you. But while you were talking, I was trying to think, do I want to share this or not? It's interesting. I have a friend who's a therapist, and I was talking to them about interviewing you, and their projection was you being a male and being German. We both made the assumption that you were German, that it would be a challenging interview. And I wasn't even holding that thought. And then once they said this, and then because I'm not as organized as I would like, I have this thing that I should be much more linear. I should be more organized. I do a good enough job, and it's not going to change, but because I would send you an email and then I'd send you another one, I started to have that projection. And it's interesting that my projection was you were responding like a traditional, what I would perceive a German male, and that you would feel irritated and annoyed by, I'm like another email and another question, and I don't have it together. And the reason why I want to share this is I think that we get these ideas of how we show up with our sensitivity and how we project. You're laughing. So I want to hear what your response is.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, first of all, I just think it's so funny how we all know, stereotypes in our heads, and how even the most people, we still have them, and I think it's fun to hear it, because although I am German, I am structured to an extent, but not that structured. I'm not rigid. So my response to you sending some emails up front was just like, oh God, I don't have really time to go through them properly and to read them, because of my son, who's very young. And so that was my response. But I prefer a free floating conversation. Yeah. So it's all good. Don't worry.
No, well, yeah. And the reason why I share it is I think that people, some of the listeners may be thinking, I could never have a podcast. You come off as being so polished and confident. And the reason why I love sharing this stuff is it doesn't matter who we are, that whatever our wounding is around our sensitivity or whatever projections we have will still come up for us. It doesn't mean that I didn't communicate. It doesn't mean that I didn't send emails. It didn't mean that I had feelings and I could have chosen to share it with you or not today. But this is just the real stuff that we go through, no matter whether we're authors or actors or famous, or we still have these things come up and we just learn how to navigate it.
Yes, and I think, it's the same for all of us. It's whether you're highly sensitive or not, or whether you identify with the concept or not. I do think that is something that I think is human. Personally.
Sure. Okay, let's jump into some of these questions. So I've been practicing. I actually asked Matt to send me an audio recording because I'm so afraid I'm going to mess up his name because it has a different accent. So I've been trying to practice in my head. So it's Matt DeFilippo wants to know how do men balance being sensitive with the traditional ideas of men being strong and not showing their emotions?
Yeah, I think there is a huge conflict for all men. I think whether they are highly sensitive or not, but I think in particular for highly sensitive men, I think it is a challenge. And I think I'm not sure that I was so clear enough about this earlier. I do think, whereas the challenges of being highly sensitive, I think in some ways, if you look at the DOS criteria, they are, of course, exactly the same for men and women. But I think on top of that, I think for highly sensitive men, the challenge is that it just doesn't, being highly sensitive, I think, just doesn't go with a masculine ideal. And I think that is the challenge, because I think it can lead to insecurities and shame and not being, not feeling worthy or whatever, or not feeling as good as feeling less masculine, maybe even less attractive, maybe even to some partners. But again, I don't want to generalize too much. I'm sure for some highly sensitive men, depending on which experiences they had, it's a different story. They might not have had those insecurities if the environment gave them maybe liked their sensitivity or encouraged it even. I don't know. So I think balancing it is tricky, but I often think, and this is from a highly sensitive men's perspective, right? So someone who's highly sensitive, how they balance it with being traditional male. Is that what the question was?
Let me read it again because it is. I need simple sentences to understand. That's
sorry. Yes. Go.
No. That's just how my brain is wired. The question was, how do men balance being sensitive with the traditional ideas of men being strong and not showing their emotions?
Well, I think they balance it by being themselves and by learning how not to be ashamed of being sensitive, which, by being reasonably authentic and confident about being sensitive, and that in itself is quite masculine, I find. And this whole idea of not showing emotions, if you're highly sensitive, you will be emotional. You will have strong emotional reactions. And I think we all know now that this idea that men should not show emotions is unhealthy. It causes huge issues for men, mental health issues. Learn about your trait and learn to appreciate your sensitivity if that is possible for you. And at the same time, remember that you are male and you are masculine just by being a man.
Yeah. What I see the most is people not liking the fact that they're not able to suppress their tears and their emotions.
Yes.
And I think that's a really hard one because, I was thinking when you were talking, there's a show called Long Island Medium. And I would say for anybody that has access to this show, if you want to look at how our culture and how people express emotions, because this is something that if you're not familiar with the show, Teresa Caputo is a medium who can talk to people that have crossed over, whether you believe in it or not. Mm-hmm. She talks to people who have lost a loved one, and it's very emotional for people. And you can physically see people's discomfort, trying to suppress their feelings, the showing of emotions. And this isn't about whether people are highly sensitive or not. This is about our cultural beliefs around expressing intense feelings of grief. And so if you want to get a little bit of validation and normalization around, it's really hard for people to allow them, the majority of people.
Yes.
It's just a great way to observe.
Yes, it is. It is, and I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right, and I think particularly for men, again, I think it comes back to this: men are not supposed to be emotional. They're maybe angry. That's all right,
Right.
but not experiencing more vulnerable feelings. But to remember that this is deeply unhealthy. And I think it is very important to, as a man and as a woman, obviously, but as a man, to learn to become good at regulating ourselves, but that includes acknowledging our feelings, that includes accepting our feelings, that includes naming our feelings. That is to remember not to feel ashamed and not shaming ourselves for being emotional. So when the tears are rolling, to do our best, to try our best not to become self-critical and shaming of ourselves.
Right. And for me, I'm a crier and I'm really okay with it. So I've gotten to the point, I'm also 56 years old, so I'm just not as invested in people pleasing as I was when I was younger. And what I hear is it's so hard because people will cry, they apologize for crying, they feel like they're doing something wrong. And then for me, trying to imagine what it would be like to be someone who identifies as male and having tears come up and feeling like that's just culturally not acceptable. And I can't tell you how many times I see on TV people start to cry and everybody says, don't cry, it's okay. Crying is a really healthy thing. And if you're a crier, it's often how we release stress. It's how we self-regulate. After I have a good cry, I just feel like it's like having a massage. I'm just like,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Yeah.
men are not born less emotional than women. I think it just shows how society functions. But I think you're right. I think it is really healthy can be quite healthy to release it. It reduces stress. And I think sticking to people who won't shame us for being emotional as men, I think is important. And to try our very best to be accepting of us being emotional and not trying to shame ourselves. Because I think often there's an inner critic that then, really condemns what happens. But it's hard.
Right. And I don't know if you see this in your practice, but when I have people that come to me and they work so hard to suppress their emotional, I prefer to use the word response as opposed to reaction. So I'm just naming what my preference is. But when people really work hard to suppress their emotional responses, they suppress their anger, they suppress their sadness. What generally happens is pretty regularly they end up having a meltdown, that they lose it. And that fear of on a daily basis of if people saw how I am, I wouldn't be like. And then they have these meltdowns that everybody sees, which can create a lot of shame.
Yes.
And not having that understanding that it's kind of like a pressure cooker, that if you don't open the valve and let those feelings out as they come up, they are going to pile up. And then we do have meltdowns, whether it's publicly or privately, and that doesn't feel good either.
Yes, exactly. And not to, I think that, and I wonder whether that requires, in a way, to really get to know our feelings a little bit and seeing them as a source of information. That doesn't mean we always have to run with every feeling we're having, and I do. Okay, I mean, to become a bit personal, I had so the book has been published in several countries in different languages, not just in German and English, but also in Swedish and in Dutch. And I had a promotional trip to Stockholm in spring, which was really great. But I was really quite nervous about it. I've never been on telly. Suddenly I had to do an unedited interview, basically live on television. I never had a massive event at a bookshop with 60 people. And so there was a bit of me that was really quite nervous and quite anxious about it up front and really didn't want to do it. And I didn't, and I'm not saying, and I think if I would have listened blindly to that feeling, it would have been a huge shame because I would have pulled out of that trip. But I really tried to explore, to explore, are there any other feelings? Is there a little bit of excitement? Is there a little bit of me that quite likes to do that? Is there anything I'm looking forward to? And also, what does this part of me that is quite nervous about it and quite anxious about it, What does it need from me? And this is the work that I'm explaining in the book as well. I think this is really important. I'm not saying it always works. I'm not saying it's always, therefore you never struggle with any difficult feelings. But I think it just shows that, yes, difficult feelings come up. I think it's important to honor them. I think it's important to make ourselves aware of them and to work with them. And I think if you become good at that, those, as you said, those massive meltdowns or those really extreme or let's say very strong reactions that then we might feel very embarrassed about later, I think are less likely to happen because we're getting better at dealing with our own feelings. Does it make sense?
It totally makes sense. And what I hear you saying in the language that I use is you named what was going on. You look to see, sometimes we get over aroused and there may be the over arousal, we pair it with something dangerous and there could have been some excitement there. There could have been some anticipation. You named it, you honored it, and then you asked yourself, what is it that I'm needing, so that you were really present for yourself. So many of us have gotten messages as children of, you worry too much, just shrug it off. It's not a big deal. So we learn how to recreate that sense of shutting things down. And what you're really doing is naming what's going on, allowing for the experience, asking yourself what you needed, seeing if there was another way that you could look at the situation so that you didn't feel so nervous. I mean, I think that's beautiful modeling. And when we write about it, talk about it, we end up doing our own work and we end up growing immensely because we're practicing what we believe in.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think it is so important I really, that is something that is, something I always aspired to when I started working as a therapist. I did the training when I wrote the book, that the things that I preach or that I write about in the book are things that I believe in and things that I practice myself and things that not all of them, and sometimes I do more than others, and not. But I do think it is important that's something I owe to my clients, and I think that's something I owe to my readers. That this is not something that the things I write about or the skills or the techniques that I mention are not completely separated from my own experience, or at least skills that I practice myself to or have practiced myself to an extent.
I'm looking at time. We don't have enough time and we've got more questions. So let's try it. My taskmaster is like, let's try and get through these. It's such a great conversation. It's just it's a factor of time. We could talk all day about this. Rita Marie wants to know, how can parents better support our young boys who show signs of being highly sensitive? So she has a son who's in pre-K and she already sees him being admonished for being too sensitive. With that pressure that Matt was talking about in the stereotypical ways of showing strength and denying emotions, portraying that they're invincible, how can she support him that's developmental in ways that are developmentally appropriate?
Yes, I think. I mean, I'm not a child therapist, but my son is very young. So, but I think what strikes me as important, having worked with many male clients, is not to shame young boys for being emotional and already then trying to make them understand or try to model or try to give them the message that being emotional is fine, really. It's, emotions are a source of information. We can handle our emotions to an extent, we can change them, we can work with them. And I think these are all really important messages, even to young boys. And I wouldn't label personally. I mean, I don't know how therapists, HSP specialized therapists who work with children say. I believe Elaine Aron thinks we shouldn't label children as highly sensitive. I think I heard her saying this. This is certainly something I wouldn't do. I wouldn't label a child as highly sensitive. But I think you can talk around sensitivity and you can talk around child being very perceptive and being maybe very aware of his environment or seeing details, fine details, little stimuli, or being quite emotional. I think you can talk around all these things. But I think not to label, not to shame, allow feelings and show them and model them through your own behavior, that feelings are important, but, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I think that seems to me important.
I really like too using a reflective type of parenting. Wow, you felt really hurt when so and so called you a name. That didn't feel good. How do you like it when your friends talk to you or treat you? It's a way of increasing awareness, and it's very validating without making anybody right or wrong. Or, you had a really hard day, and that's, I notice that you sometimes need some quiet time after you've been out playing for a lot of time. That's really helpful for you, isn't that? That there are ways that we can talk about the trait without just with naming it. And then the child starts to recognize like, oh, I need to rest after I've had a long day, or, oh, that doesn't feel good when somebody talks to me that way. This is how I like to talk to my friends. And when the parents can really be there and support the child and stay calm for them and to give them reassurances, that's also how we model to our kids to embrace all of our feelings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that is very true. And I think we can, to an extent, I'm also, I also think it's important to mention this to people who don't have children. I mean, whether you have nieces or nephews, or children, obviously in a boundaried way, but children of your friends or whatever. I think you can always model being a sensitive man or highly sensitive man to them. You can always model a masculinity that includes being emotional and sensitive and reflective. So I think there are possibilities to be a bit of a role model to children, whether you have them yourself or not.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Brianna wanted to know, where does it begin for men to believe everything they are told instead of listening to their inner voice?
I mean, I think it's just, part of being socialized. I think it is. And again, I think my sense is that it's the same for women. I think there are other messages that, women are being told, people who identify as women. I, for example, I often think about women who decide not to have children. I see this a lot in my psychotherapeutic practice, where I see men and women, that I still think for a lot of women that goes hugely against what they were told, that they should want children. Or so I think it happens for both, for men and women. So I think it happens very early on. I mean, I do think it's part of being socialized. Yeah, I think in childhood even.
Yeah, I think again that when we come from a very authoritative point of view with our parenting, chances are if our kids do have any sense of intuition, that may be overridden because from an authoritative point of view, the parent knows best. And again, that reflection of giving kids choices, or if they say they knew something, that there's a way that we can talk to them about that to really, oh, you had a sense about this. What does your body say? What do you want to eat? What does your tummy say? Are you full? Are you tired? Do you need to play? That there are ways that we can still guide our children and not be totally permissive, but really honor how they show up and really nurture the qualities that they come with.
Yes, exactly. And to keep that in mind, not to overload them with choices that are, overwhelming to them, but at the same time to really, as you said, to focus in our parenting on feelings, on intuition, on, in a way, self-care, early self-care, really, without using the word, maybe. I think it's really important. Yes.
Right. And then one of my pet peeves is, please don't ever, 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 ever call your child or anybody else's child shy, or any adult. Part of what we know about the trait of high sensitivity is many of us like to stand on the sidelines and observe until we get the lay of the land. And to label anybody as being shy is one of the most damaging things. And I can't tell you how many adults I work with that tell me that either as children or even as adults, people judge them because they're more quiet, they're more introverted. There's a lot going on for them internally.
Yeah.
But our culture is based on extroverted non-HSPs. And so there's really not language or ways to honor those people that need a little bit more time.
Absolutely. And I think, it happens so early on, I mean, even with my son, who's now a year old, when he was sort of, 6 months, there were people who said, oh, and he's really not, I mean, anyway, but the word shy does get thrown around quite quickly when it comes to children, and quite early on. And I just think, I can relate to the sense of feeling shy, but I think it's important not to throw it around too quickly. I think you're right, because I think it often doesn't really correctly describe what's actually going on for the person. I mean, shy would be a fear of social judgment, and often I think when someone is quiet or observing, it doesn't necessarily have to do with a fear of social judgment. And a 6-month-old baby or 1-year-old, they're not aware of social judgment yet. So they can't be shy.
Yep. And I'll tell you, I have twin boys, and how they presented as babies and in childhood, they're 19 and a half now. They've almost done a flip-flop. And so obviously as a parent, I had predicted how each of them would turn out. They have really surprised me. And so we never know what's going to happen with how our kids are going to grow up and how their traits or tendencies are going to either turn into strengths or they're going to go another way. So kids are just kind of amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just let them develop and and grow, and let's hold back with the labels.
Yep. Tom, we're going to switch gears now because we're going to need to wrap up. What are some of your superpowers being a highly sensitive person?
Well, I think I'm quite a good observer. I think I observe subtleties around me. I think I process those subtleties very, very strongly, very deeply. And I think that is something that, for example, really influenced my career choice to become a therapist. I know that there's, just very briefly, I know that we often talk about the negative aspects of being highly sensitive. And I think one positive aspect for me really is I'm very good at catching if someone is not authentic, if someone talks bullshit, basically. So I just think these are all things that I feel I would see as a strength for sure.
We kind of need to wrap up now. Do you want to tell people about, well, let me ask you this. Is there something that we haven't talked about that you feel is important to cover before we wrap up?
I think what I said earlier is really quite important to me. I think it's a book that I wrote for men and with highly sensitive men in mind, but it's not a book that excludes women. I think it is a book that can be very helpful for women if they want to know more about their highly sensitive husbands or fathers or brothers or children, sons. So that is really quite important to me. It's an inclusive book, that is quite important. And I think we covered pretty much everything. I'm very sleep deprived, as I said earlier, so I hope I made sense.
You were very clear.
Okay. And thank you very much for asking great questions. And I hope your listeners found it helpful and enjoyable, our conversation. And the book is out now in English. There's quite a lot of stuff in the pipeline, but for sure, what I'll do for sure is a workshop for highly sensitive people in January in the Netherlands, in English, 2-day workshop on self-care and empowerment for highly sensitive people. I've got a website. Maybe that's important for people to know if they're interested.
Why don't you let people know what your website is? All this will be in the show notes, including your website, the name of your book.
Yes.
But for people that don't go to the show notes, and the show notes are at unapologeticallysensitive.com. Just go to the podcast page and then click on Tom's episode.
It's www.hsp-eu.com. That's my website. So hsp-eu.com. And I'm also on Instagram under my name, Tom Falkenstein, and the book is called The Highly Sensitive Men. And it's published by Kensington Books.
That sounds great. And Tom, is there anything else before we say goodbye? This has been great. And I just want to do 2-hour interviews because we're getting to all the good stuff now.
Yeah, I agree. I think we could go on. No, just thank you very much. I feel like we covered important bits, and what I really try to do is not to generalize too much in the book. When we talk about men and highly sensitive men, I'm aware that there are loads of differences, and that is really quite important to me as a message. And at the same time, the book really is a plea for more diversity when it comes to masculinity, and to challenge those very rigid norms of masculinity, which are deeply unhealthy, I think. And that is why I wrote the book. And I'm very happy it's out there. It's available in English. For some reason, I've got loads of friends in in Britain and I lived in the UK for a long time. And so therefore, in English, I've got friends in America. So an English translation was very important to me. So I'm super happy that it's out there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate it. Have a good evening. I hope you sleep well. It's noon my time, so it's 80 degrees where I'm at. So
I'm going to eat something now. I'm starving. But thank you very much for the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Bye bye.
Hey there. So I'm curious to know what you thought about the conversation. It felt to me that it was a little slow to warm up and to get going, but once we got warmed up and jumped into it, man, I really love this conversation. And there are times when I really want to keep the podcast longer than an hour just because there's so much to talk about. If you're struggling with any of the traits of being highly sensitive, if you heard things that resonated with you, please jump over to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I run online courses for the highly sensitive person. They've been really powerful. I work individually with people all over the world. All the work that I do is online, so it's very easy and convenient to do it from the comfort of your own home or for work, wherever you have privacy. And if you didn't know, you can follow me on social media. You can, again, go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I'm on Pinterest. I have a YouTube channel. I'm on Instagram. There's an open page on Facebook called Unapologetically Sensitive, and we have a closed Facebook group also called Unapologetically Sensitive. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.